What if I told you that the deadliest weapons in human history were never forged in any armory? They were not swords, they were not cannons, they were not nuclear bombs. They were creatures so small that nobody could see them. Bacteria, viruses, microbes carried on the breath of a stranger or hidden in the bite of a single flea. And when they struck, no army could defend a country. No king could outrun them. No prayer could stop them. Across the centuries, humanity has buried more people in mass graves dug for plague victims than for every soldier who ever died in battle. Kings have collapsed beside beggars. Empires have crumbled in a single summer. Cities of 100,000 have fallen silent within months. The numbers are not in the thousands, they are in the millions. In some cases, hundreds of millions. In this video, we will count down the 12 worst plagues in human history, ranked by the chilling number of lives they erased from the world. Some of them you have heard of. Some of them you have never been told about. All of them changed the course of civilization forever, and some of them shaped the world you are living in right now. But before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you do not miss any of these dark chapters of history. After that, leave a comment and tell us which forgotten plague you would like us to explore in the future. Now, take a deep breath and let us travel back through the centuries to the moments when humanity stood face to face with extinction itself. Number 12. The Plague of Athens. Around 100,000 dead. The year is 430 BC. Athens stands at the very peak of its golden age. Pericles is building the Parthenon. Sophocles is writing tragedies that will be performed for the next 2,500 years. Socrates is walking the streets, asking questions that will give birth to Western philosophy. The city is the brightest light in the ancient world. And then it begins to die. Sparta has been at war with Athens for a year. The Spartan armies are camped outside the walls, burning the surrounding countryside. Pericles has ordered every Athenian from the surrounding villages to retreat behind the long walls of the city. Refugees pour in. They sleep in the streets, in the temples, in any shaded corner they can find. Tens of thousands of people packed shoulder to shoulder in the heat of the Greek summer. And into this crowded city, something arrives by ship from Egypt. Nobody has ever seen anything like it. The historian Thucydides, who survived it, described the symptoms in terrifying detail. The skin would erupt in pustules. The throat would burn. The thirst became so violent that victims threw themselves into wells, trying to drink the world dry. Within a week, most of the infected were dead. Those who survived were often left blind or with their fingers and toes blackened and dropping away. The disease tore through Athens with the speed of a fire in dry grass. Doctors died first because they tended to the sick. Priests died at the altars. Pericles himself, the great architect of Athenian democracy, was killed by it. The dead were stacked in piles outside the temples. People gave up burying their relatives properly. Strangers threw bodies onto pyres lit for someone else. And then something darker than the disease itself began to spread. The Athenians lost faith. They saw that the pious died as quickly as the impious. They saw that there was no logic, no justice, no escape. Laws were ignored. Wealth was spent recklessly because nobody believed they would live to inherit anything. Thucydides called it the death of civilization itself, even more than the death of bodies. By the time the plague burned itself out, around 100,000 Athenians lay dead, a quarter of the population. The city would never recover its old confidence. Athens would lose the war with Sparta. The Golden Age would end. And historians have argued ever since that the Western world we know today was shaped not by Pericles, but by whatever microbe sailed off that Egyptian ship in the summer of 430 BC. Number 11. The Great Plague of London. Around 100,000 dead. 1665. The Restoration is in full swing. Charles II sits on the English throne. London is a thriving, dirty, crowded city of nearly 500,000 souls. The streets are narrow, the houses are crammed together in timber and thatch, and the rats outnumber the people. The plague had visited London many times before, but this one was different. It began in the slums of St. Giles in the freezing weeks of late winter. By spring, it had crawled across the parishes. By summer, it was killing 7,000 people a week. The bills of mortality, the weekly death notices posted on every church door, became the most important reading in London. Families would scan them in horror, looking for streets they recognized, watching the death toll climb every Thursday. The wealthy fled. King Charles took his court to Oxford. Anyone with land in the country packed up their carriages and ran. The poor had nowhere to go. They were locked into their homes, sometimes with the sick, sometimes with the dead, by order of the city government. A red cross was painted on the door, with the words, "Lord, have mercy upon us." A watchman was posted outside to make sure nobody came in or out. Inside those houses, families sat with their dying children. Husbands listened to the rasping breath of their wives. Mothers held babies who would never grow up. Anyone showing symptoms, the swollen black buboes on the neck and groin that gave bubonic plague its name, knew they had perhaps 3 days to live. The disease announced itself with fever, headaches, a feeling of unbearable exhaustion. Then the buboes erupted. Then came the delirium. Then came the silence. At night, the death carts rolled through the streets. The drivers rang a bell and shouted, "Bring out your dead." Corpses were loaded together and tipped into mass graves outside the city. Some of those plague pits still lie beneath modern London. Whenever workers dig deep enough for new tunnels or foundations, they still find the bones. The plague raged for over a year before the cold winter and a peculiar gift of Providence finally ended it. In September 1666, a baker on Pudding Lane left an oven unattended. The Great Fire of London consumed 4/5 of the old city. It was a catastrophe in itself, but it also burned the rats, the fleas, the contaminated houses, and the very air of the plague. London was reborn from ash. But over 100,000 of its people, nearly a quarter of its population, never saw the rebuilding. Number 10. The Italian Plague of 1629 to 1631.
around 1 million dead. We move now to 17th century Italy.
The 30 Years' War is tearing Europe apart. Armies of mercenaries from France, Germany and Spain are pouring back and forth across the Alps. And with them, in their packs, in their clothes, in the rats that follow their supply wagons, comes the plague. Northern Italy at this time is one of the richest and most cultured regions on earth. Venice is still a maritime power. Milan is a centre of trade and craftsmanship. Florence is the home of art and banking. The cities are dense, beautiful, and utterly defenceless against what is coming. It begins in 1629. French and German troops cross into Lombardy carrying the disease. Within months, Milan is in agony. The streets fill with the sound of weeping. Public officials issue desperate orders. Funerals are banned. Markets are closed. The lazzarettos, the giant quarantine hospitals on the edges of the cities, fill beyond capacity. In Venice, the famous Lazzaretto Vecchio took in so many dying that contemporaries described it as a place where the living and the dead lay in the same beds. And then a new horror appeared in the Italian imagination: the plague spreaders. Rumours began to circulate that the disease was not natural, but was being spread deliberately by foreign agents, witches, heretics, people accused of smearing plague-infected ointments on doorways and church benches. Mobs hunted them through the streets. Innocent men and women were tortured into confessions and executed. The novelist Alessandro Manzoni would later describe these events in detail in his book The Betrothed, a story still read in every Italian school. Venice, the queen of the Adriatic, lost a third of its population. Milan lost nearly half. Verona, Padua, Bologna, all of them gutted. Entire villages in the countryside ceased to exist. By the time the plague subsided in 1631, around 1 million Italians lay dead. Italy, which had dominated European art, banking and trade for 3 centuries, never regained its former power. The economic centre of Europe shifted permanently north, towards the Netherlands, towards England, towards the future. A microbe had quietly redrawn the map of European civilization. Number 9. The Russian flu. Around 1 million dead. The year is 1889. The world is more connected than it has ever been. Steamships cross the Atlantic in days. Railways stretch across continents. Telegraph cables carry news from London to Bombay in minutes. And it is precisely this new global network that allows the next pandemic to do something no plague has ever done before: travel at the speed of trains. It begins, almost certainly, in the city of Bukhara, in what is now Uzbekistan. Within weeks, it is in St. Petersburg. By December 1889, it is sweeping across Russia, killing the elderly and the weak. Then it crosses borders: Berlin, Paris, London, New York. Each great capital falls in turn, almost on the timetable of a railway map. It came to be called the Russian flu, although nobody is entirely sure where it really started. The symptoms were familiar: fever, exhaustion, a hacking cough, a strange neurological haze that left survivors feeling broken for weeks. What was unusual was the speed. By the spring of 1890, the disease had encircled the planet. the first truly global pandemic in human history, and the first of its kind made possible entirely by modern transport. The death toll was around 1 million people. Compared to what would come later in this list, that may sound small. But the Russian flu mattered for another reason. It showed every government on Earth that distance no longer protected a country from infection. Quarantine, the great defense of the medieval city, no longer worked. A passenger could carry the disease from Moscow to Boston before showing a single symptom.
Modern researchers studying old samples now suspect that the Russian flu may not have been an influenza at all, but an early outbreak of a coronavirus. Some scientists believe one of its descendants is still circulating today as a common cold. If that is true, then the Russian flu never really ended. It simply learned to live with us, watching humanity, waiting, biding its time. Number 8. The Plague of Cyprian. Around 5 million dead. We return now to the ancient world. The year is 249 AD. The Roman Empire, the greatest power the planet has ever known, is starting to wobble. Emperors are being murdered every few years. The borders are being attacked by Goths, Persians, Berbers. Inflation is destroying the currency. And then, into this already collapsing world, walks an enemy that no legion can fight. It begins in Ethiopia, sweeping north through Egypt, then erupting across the Mediterranean. The Christian bishop of Carthage, a man called Cyprian, watched his congregation die around him and wrote one of the few surviving descriptions of the disease. Bowels constantly empty, the throat scorched, eyes burning red, the body covered in a foul corruption, many dead within hours of their first symptoms. Modern researchers still argue about what the disease actually was. Smallpox is one possibility. A type of hemorrhagic fever similar to Ebola is another. Whatever it was, it killed at terrifying speed. At its peak, around 5,000 people were dying every day in the city of Rome alone. 2 emperors, Justinian and Claudius II, died of it. The borders of the empire weakened as legionaries collapsed in their forts. The Plague of Cyprian lasted on and off for over 15 years. By the time it faded, perhaps 5 million people had died. The Roman world was shaken to its core. Towns were abandoned, fields went unploughed, tax revenues collapsed. But there was a stranger consequence too. The Christian church grew. While pagan priests fled the dying, Christians nursed the sick, buried the dead, fed the orphans. People who had survived because of Christian charity converted in their thousands. Bishop Cyprian himself was eventually executed for his faith. But within a generation, Christianity had become unstoppable. A century after the plague that bears his name, an emperor of Rome would be baptized. The disease had not just killed millions. It had quietly tilted the moral and religious axis of the Western world for the next 2,000 years. Number 7. The Antonine Plague. Around 10 million dead. Roll the clock back further. The year is 165 AD. The Roman Empire, under the philosopher-emperor Marcus Aurelius, has reached the absolute peak of its power.
Its borders stretch from the Atlantic coast of Spain to the deserts of Iraq. Its armies are the most disciplined on Earth. Its cities are the wealthiest in human history.
And then a returning army brings something home from the east. Roman troops have just sacked the Parthian city of Seleucia in Mesopotamia. According to the old chroniclers, a soldier opened a sealed casket inside a temple. From the casket, a vapor emerged. It was a story, a legend, a piece of myth. But the disease the legions brought back with them was very real. It is now believed to have been smallpox, although it could also have been measles. In either case, the Roman population had no immunity. The plague raced from Persia, through Greece, through Egypt, into Italy, into Gaul, even up to the cold Roman forts on Hadrian's Wall in Britain. It would last for 15 years. The mortality was staggering. At its peak, 2,000 people died every day in Rome itself. The Roman doctor Galen, the most famous physician of antiquity, described the symptoms in detail. Black pustules, a horrible cough, blood in the stool. He called it the Great Plague. Even Emperor Lucius Verus, co-ruler with Marcus Aurelius, died from it in 169. Estimates of the total death toll now run as high as 10 million people across the empire, perhaps a tenth of the entire population. Whole legions evaporated. The army that had once expanded the empire now had to be rebuilt with barbarian recruits. Roman trade with India and China collapsed. And like so many of the great plagues, the Antonine Plague did not just kill bodies, it cracked the foundations of the empire. The peace and stability of the 2nd century, the great age of Roman power, ended with this disease. The 3rd century would be one of the most violent in Roman history. Civil wars, inflation, invasions. Many historians now argue that the long, slow fall of Rome did not begin with barbarians or corruption. It began with a microbe carried home by a victorious soldier in 165 AD. Number 6. The Third Plague Pandemic. Around 12 to 15 million dead. We jump now to the late 19th century. The British Empire spans the globe. Steamships connect every port. The world feels modern, scientific, civilized. And then, in 1855, in a remote province of southwestern China called Yunnan, the Black Death reawakens. It had been quiet for centuries, but it had never gone away. It had been waiting in the burrows of marmots and rats in the highlands of Asia. Local wars and disturbed trade routes seemed to have stirred it up again. From Yunnan, it crept down into the Chinese coast. By the 1890s, it had reached Hong Kong. From Hong Kong, on British steamships, it sailed everywhere. Bombay, Calcutta, San Francisco, Sydney, Buenos Aires. The plague that had once needed years to cross continents now took weeks. The Third Plague Pandemic, as it would later be called, was the same disease that had wiped out medieval Europe. But this time, it ran into something new: modern science. In 1894, in a small laboratory in Hong Kong, a Swiss-French scientist named Alexandre Yersin isolated the bacterium responsible for the plague, Yersinia pestis. The killer that had stalked humanity for 2,000 years
suddenly had a name, a face under a microscope. Researchers traced the chain of infection: rats, fleas, humans. The mystery that had baffled doctors from the time of Pericles to the time of Queen Victoria was solved at last. But the dying did not stop. India alone lost 12 million people to the plague between 1900 and 1950. Whole districts emptied. The British colonial authorities, still unable to fully control the disease, panicked. They burned villages. They forcibly removed populations. They created lasting resentments that would help fuel the Indian independence movement. By the time the third plague pandemic was declared officially over in 1959, somewhere between 12 and 15 million people had died. And here is the chilling part. The plague is not gone. There are still cases reported every year in Madagascar, in the western United States, in Central Asia. The Black Death is not extinct, it is simply outnumbered. For now. Number 5. The cocoliztli epidemic. Around 15 million dead. Now we cross the Atlantic to a disaster so complete that historians still struggle to describe it. The year is 1545. Mexico, only 24 years earlier, was the heart of the Aztec Empire, a civilization of perhaps 25 million people. The Spanish, under Hernán Cortés, had toppled it. But the people, the descendants of the Aztecs and Maya and Mixtec and Zapotec, were still there. And then they began to die. Not from war, not from slavery, from something the Spanish doctors had never seen and the local healers could not name. They simply called it cocoliztli, an Aztec word meaning pestilence. The disease was horrifying. High fever, severe headaches, tongues turned black, blood pouring from the eyes, the nose, the mouth. Most of the infected died within 3 or 4 days, and almost all of the dead were indigenous. The Spanish, by some quirk of immunity or genetics, were largely spared. Whole villages of native Mexicans collapsed. Fields lay unharvested. Children wandered through empty plazas. For decades, scholars assumed cocoliztli must have been smallpox or typhus. But in 2018, scientists analyzing the teeth of victims buried in mass graves identified the real culprit. A strain of salmonella, possibly carried by livestock brought from Europe. The native population, isolated for thousands of years, had no defense against it. The death toll was apocalyptic. The first wave in 1545 alone killed perhaps 8 million people. A second wave in 1576 killed another 2 million. By the time the cocoliztli epidemics had run their course, around 15 million indigenous Mexicans had perished. The population of central Mexico had collapsed by 90% in less than a century when you combine cocoliztli with smallpox and the other diseases the Spanish brought. The Aztec world ended not on the day Cortés entered the capital. It ended in the slow, agonizing decades of dying that followed. An entire civilization was hollowed out from within by an enemy nobody could see. And the consequences are still being felt 500 years later in every village across Mexico whose ruins still stand silent above the bones. Number 4. The HIV and AIDS pandemic. Around 40 million dead. We move now from the ancient past to a plague that began in our parents' lifetimes and is still killing people today. In the late 1970s, doctors in New York and Los Angeles began to notice something deeply strange. Young men, otherwise healthy, were arriving in clinics with rare cancers and pneumonias usually only seen in the very old. Their immune systems had simply stopped working.
By 1981, the disease had a name: Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome, AIDS. By 1983, the cause had been identified: the Human Immunodeficiency Virus, HIV. Tracing the virus backwards in time, scientists realized that HIV had jumped from chimpanzees to humans somewhere in Central Africa, probably as early as the 1920s. For decades, it had moved quietly through small communities. But the modern world of jet travel, of cities, of global tourism gave it the highways it needed to become a pandemic. The 1980s and 1990s were the worst years. The virus tore through gay communities, through intravenous drug users, through the heterosexual populations of sub-Saharan Africa. There was no cure. There was no effective treatment. To be diagnosed with HIV was to be told that your life had perhaps a few short years left. Hospital wards filled with skeletal patients. Funerals became weekly events for entire communities. And then there was the cruelty.
Politicians who refused to even say the name of the disease because the early victims were socially marginalized. Religious leaders who declared it a divine punishment. Families who turned their dying sons away at the door. The American President Ronald Reagan did not give a public address on AIDS until 1985, by which time tens of thousands of his own citizens were already dead. In Africa, the situation was even worse. South Africa, Botswana, Zimbabwe, Uganda, all lost staggering percentages of their adult populations. Children grew up in villages run by grandmothers because every adult between 20 and 40 had died. By the late 1990s, life expectancy in some African countries had dropped by 20 years. Then, in 1996, came the breakthrough. Antiretroviral therapy, a combination of drugs that could not cure HIV, but could suppress it indefinitely. Suddenly, an HIV diagnosis was no longer a death sentence. But the drugs were expensive, and for years they were rationed cruelly between the rich and poor of the world. Today, the virus is treatable, even preventable, but it is still here. It is still spreading. It is still killing. And the total dead in the 4 decades since AIDS was first identified now stands at around 40 million people.
Number 3. The Plague of Justinian. Around 50 million dead. The year is 541 AD. The Western Roman Empire has fallen to the Goths, but the Eastern Roman Empire, ruled from Constantinople by the brilliant Emperor Justinian, is in the middle of a magnificent comeback. Justinian's armies have just reconquered North Africa, much of Italy, parts of Spain. He is on the verge of restoring the Roman Empire to something like its old glory. And then a grain ship arrives in Constantinople from Egypt. In its hold are rats. In the rats are fleas. In the fleas is something that has been hiding in the mountains of Central Asia for centuries. Yersinia pestis.
The plague.
The historian Procopius, who lived through it, left one of the most chilling eyewitness accounts in all of history. The disease, he said, came on with no warning,
A man would feel a fever in the morning. By the afternoon, the buboes would have erupted on his neck and groin. By the next day, he would be raving with hallucinations. By the third day, he would be dead. At its peak, 10,000 people died every single day in Constantinople alone. The streets filled with bodies. The gravediggers gave up. Justinian ordered the towers of the city walls hollowed out and stuffed with corpses. Procopius described the smell of the city as unbearable for miles in every direction. The emperor himself caught the plague and survived, but his empire never recovered. The plague did not stop at Constantinople. It rolled across Europe, across the Middle East, into North Africa, possibly as far as Britain and Ireland. It returned in waves for the next 200 years, and the total death toll, slowly tallied across decades, is now estimated at around 50 million people. The world it left behind was utterly changed. Justinian's dream of a restored Roman Empire died with his soldiers. The exhausted Byzantine and Persian empires would soon be unable to resist a new force rising out of the Arabian desert. The armies of early Islam, riding into a depopulated, devastated Mediterranean, found cities they could simply walk into. The plague had cleared the way for the rise of an entirely new civilization. One microbe, one ship, one cargo of grain, and the world had a new map. Number 2. The Spanish Flu. Around 50 to 100 million dead. The First World War is in its final months. November 1918. 16 million people have died in the trenches and on the home fronts. And then, just as the guns are about to fall silent, a second wave of dying begins. A wave that will kill more people in a single year than 4 years of industrial warfare. The Spanish flu did not start in Spain. It probably started in a military camp in Kansas, or possibly in China, or in northern France. It got its name only because Spain, neutral in the war, allowed its newspapers to report on the disease honestly. Every other country, terrified of damaging morale, censored the truth. Soldiers were dying by the thousand in the camps and the trenches, and the public was not being told. The flu came in 3 terrible waves. The first, in the spring of 1918, was relatively mild. The second, beginning in August 1918, was catastrophic. And the third, in the winter of 1919, finished the work. What made the Spanish flu so terrifying was who it killed. Most flus prey on the very old and the very young. This one killed healthy adults in the prime of life. It triggered a massive overreaction in the immune system, drowning the lungs in fluid. Soldiers in the trenches who had survived gas attacks and machine guns died choking on their own bodily fluids in field hospitals. It spread at the speed of the modern world. Trains, steamships, troop transports moving men from continent to continent. Within 12 months, the flu had reached every corner of the globe. Eskimo villages in Alaska, where every adult died. Pacific Islands, where missionaries returned from the next island to find nobody alive. The numbers are staggering. India alone lost between 15 and 17 million people. The United States lost 675,000. Globally,
The death toll has been revised upwards over the years as historians have uncovered more evidence. The most recent serious estimates run between 50 and 100 million people. That is between 3 and 5% of every human being alive in 1918. And the cruelty of it was that nobody could even agree to call it a plague.
Many of the dead were buried in mass graves with no headstones. Many of the survivors never spoke of it again. For most of the 20th century, the worst pandemic in modern history was practically forgotten. It took the arrival of a new pandemic in our own time to remind the world that the Spanish flu had ever happened at all. Number 1. The Black Death. Around 200 million dead. We come at last to the deadliest plague in the history of the human species. The disease that emptied half of Europe. The catastrophe that scarred every culture from China to Iceland. The Black Death. It begins, like the Plague of Justinian, in Central Asia. By the 1330s, it is moving along the Silk Road, killing as it goes. In 1346, Mongol armies are besieging the Genoese trading post of Kaffa on the Black Sea. The plague breaks out among the besiegers. According to one account, the Mongols catapult their own infected dead over the walls, the first recorded act of biological warfare in history.
The Genoese flee in their ships. In October 1347, 12 Genoese galleys limp into the harbour of Messina in Sicily. The crews are mostly dead. Those still alive are dying. The harbour authorities try to send the ships away, but the rats have already come ashore. What follows is the worst single event in the recorded history of mankind. Within 5 years, the Black Death will burn through Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. It will kill, by modest estimates, 75 million people. By more recent estimates, 200 million. In England, half the population dies. In some Italian cities, 3/4. In some monasteries, every single monk perishes. The symptoms are infamous. Buboes the size of eggs in the armpits and groin, black blotches under the skin where the blood vessels have burst, which give the plague its name. A coughing form that drowns the lungs and spreads on the breath. Once it has you, you will be dead within 5 days, often within hours.
Boccaccio in Florence watches his city collapse. Friends abandon friends, parents abandon children. The cathedrals are full of corpses laid out in heaps. The dead are buried in trenches like ship's cargo. Some people believe the world is ending. Many think God has forsaken them. Some respond with hysterical religion, the flagellants, marching from town to town, whipping themselves bloody to atone for humanity's sins. Others respond with hatred, accusing Jewish communities of poisoning wells. Thousands of Jews are massacred across Europe in one of the worst pogroms before the 20th century. Whole villages cease to exist. Forests grow back over fields that had been ploughed for 1,000 years. Wages, suddenly scarce, double and triple, beginning the slow death of the feudal system. The Catholic Church, having promised protection that did not come, loses much of its authority. The Reformation, the Renaissance, the rise of the modern individual, all of it can be traced back through long chains of cause and effect to the catastrophic break that the Black Death made in medieval life. The plague did not vanish. It returned in wave after wave for the next 400 years.
London, Marseille, Vienna, Moscow. Each generation feared its return. 200 million dead is a number too vast for the human mind to hold. It is more than every person killed in every war of the 20th century combined. It is, by almost every measure, the worst thing that ever happened to our species. And it was caused by a microscopic bacterium riding in the gut of a flea, riding on the back of a rat, hidden in the cargo of a single ship. So there we have it, 12 plagues, 12 catastrophes, hundreds of millions of lives. From the smoke-filled streets of ancient Athens to the antiseptic hospitals of modern Africa, the great pandemics of history have shaped our species more deeply than any war, any king, any revolution. They have toppled empires that armies could not touch. They have rewired the religions, the economies, the very genetics of the human race. The world we live in today, the borders we see on the map, the languages we speak, the medicines we trust, the institutions we obey, were all forged in the long shadow of disease. And yet, here we still are. The plague tried to wipe out medieval Europe. We came back. The Spanish flu tried to finish what the war had started. We came back. HIV, smallpox, the Black Death, cocoliztli, every microscopic enemy that ever marched against us has been outlived by the children of its survivors. But the story is not over. The microbes are still out there. They are still mutating. The next great plague is somewhere on this planet right now, taking its first breath. The only question is whether we will remember the lessons of these 12, or whether we will, like every generation before us, have to learn them all again, the hard way. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. If you enjoyed this video and want more dark, forgotten chapters of human history, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you do not miss what is coming next. And tell us in the comments which of these 12 plagues you found the most terrifying, and which historical disaster you would like us to cover in our next video. See you in the next one.